It's the start of a grand concord and lasting harmony for Israel and all the nations of what will soon be a truly magnificent region. I believe that so strongly. This is the historic dawn of a new Middle East.
Clearly, U.S. President Donald Trump wants to portray the ceasefire agreement he engineered for Gaza as the beginning of something much larger than that, and that is a dawn of peace and prosperity and so on across the entire Middle East, which, as far as we can make out from what we know of his previous statements and views, or from what he said more recently, includes, I think, forging and deepening U.S. alliances in the region, and in particular in the Gulf, with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, with Qatar. And this is related, of course, always to energy flow. But there's also the suggestion of still trying to seek a negotiated agreement with Iran and bringing Iran within this broader concept. And so there is an attempt to envisage a new kind of Middle East, a new kind of regional order, in which there are both, there's less conflict, less armed conflict, while at the same time securing American interests, which include, ironically, very major arms sales to the region. So there's a very grand design. And what's interesting here partly is that where it starts with the Gaza ceasefire is actually very modest, very tenuous, very fragile. And there's going to be a very big question about whether or not this U.S. administration and any to come will in fact invest significantly in the Palestinian file, in helping Palestinians reach self-determination and statehood, while also pursuing their bigger interest in a new regional order with a secure U.S. set of alliances, or whether what will happen is what's happened every time since 1948, in which every single U.S. administration has focused on U.S. interests in the region, national security interests, energy interests, and alliances, but always left the Palestinian angle to Israel to decide. The real battle always was and always will remain for the West Bank between the far right and the ultra-religious nationalist camp in Israel, which seeks to annex the entirety of what remains of the old British Mandate Palestine, in other words, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. What I think is crucial here, it's not now, so it's problematic that President Trump has not put the West Bank up there on the agenda, on the radar explicitly. It's clearly there, though, for the French-Saudi peace proposal known as the New York Declaration that was approved 3 or 4 months ago at the United Nations by about 140 countries. And that is very concrete in laying out what it sees as the two-state outcome of this whole situation. The same for the Arab plan championed by Egypt a few months earlier, which focused on reconstruction of Gaza. So I think there is a chance right now to maintain the diplomatic pressure, but also the grassroots global solidarity movement, the actions at the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, deeming Israeli occupation of these territories illegal, and therefore all activity there, including settlement activity, entirely illegal. If we assume that the Gaza ceasefire holds in that positive, constructive sense, then I think that, first of all, President Trump will not allow Israel to sabotage the rest of U.S. regional policy if that regional policy involves finding a way of finding a compromise with Iran. And I think President Trump has made it very clear on at least 2 occasions this year that while he's also willing to go to war with Iran, as we saw briefly in July, that at the same time he keeps coming back to the theme of making peace with Iran. And I think that is his core preference and his core instinct, despite anything else. And so I think it's going to become very difficult for Prime Minister Netanyahu to go to war with Iran again, especially as Iranian allies in the region mostly have been very severely weakened or contained or lost. Hezbollah in Lebanon is no longer a military threat to Israel of any genuine significant nature. Iran lost its longest ally in the region, which was the Syrian president, the Assad family. And the pro-Iran militias in Iraq, while still influential, are more or less keeping a low profile and are somewhat contained. And even in Yemen, the Houthi movement, while being very close to Iran, is a more independent actor, actually, and may or may not coordinate what it does with Iran. But overall, Iran doesn't pose the same kind of threat it did. It's in a weakened position. Its domestic politics and socio-economic situation are very poor. There's, I think, a growing sense that the Iranian regime around Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is challenged on things like providing drinking water, employment, and so on, in ways it can no longer address. And I think that there's scope for political change, or at least political debate in Iran, that is growing basically with every month. The kind of position that Lebanese President Joseph Aoun or the Prime Minister Nawaf Salam put forward of wanting to disarm Hezbollah, but wanting to do so through political dialogue and discussion and agreement, not by force, that this approach is actually sensible and has merit, because it's what the US administration has just done in Gaza. That would be a positive outcome. The negative one is where the US keeps pushing in Lebanon for a more decisive and, if you might say, blunt approach to the question of disarming Hezbollah. It's interesting and maybe sad or tragic for Lebanon that the US emphasis on disarming Hezbollah is so central and exclusive that the huge issue of financial reform in Lebanon and resolving the deep economic crisis, the banking crisis that the government of Lebanon desperately needs to resolve, that this is being sidelined and even maybe delayed or damaged by the exclusive focus on disarming Hezbollah. The US has enormous leverage, especially on the financial and economic issue with Lebanon. It has a unique opportunity to help reform of the economy and of public finances and of the banking sector in Lebanon. And it should be working on two tracks. So I'm just hoping that that approach that so far has been very one-sided, focused on blunt threats and use of force, or encouraging a more sort of militarized approach to the question of disarming Hezbollah, that is worrying. And yes, if that is the approach that remains dominant, then this Israeli government and this Israeli prime minister, who clearly has seen war as a way of escaping his domestic political problems, he may well want maybe not to go to full war in Lebanon again, but to keep escalating the military pressure in Lebanon, ostensibly to force Hezbollah to surrender its remaining weapons, but really as another way of finding some other war to wage in order to run away from his domestic political problems. These armies are far more dependent on US weapons supply and know-how. Their defense industries are more independent and have relationships in Africa and relationships in Europe and even, and with Turkey, Russia, China. So I think if we project forwards a few years, we're going to have a Gulf that is extremely friendly to the US, does a lot of business with the US, but has a more independent say on geopolitics, whether that is on what to do about Iran, where the Gulf were not happy about the prospect of a war in the Gulf with Iran, and where they're also not happy about what Israel is doing in the occupied Palestinian territories. So there are shifts there too, and so along with the domestic political shifts within American public opinion, coming up as a bottom-up pressure on the Trump administration to be a bit more even-handed vis-a-vis Israel and the rest of the Middle East and the Palestinians, we have also these governments, very important governments and trade partners and energy partners and military alliance partners for the US, also now trying to build what looks like a more equal relationship with the US. I think these are healthy trends, frankly, because they create a situation which both sides have to give and take, which after all is very much the Trump ideology. You know, the Gulf feels that it needs a better deal, and it's now working to get a better deal. So Saudi Arabia is still trying to find a way of being an influential player, realizing that it has to exercise foreign policy influence in order to protect its own domestic security and stability and its economic growth and so on, that it needs the region also to be in a better place. It's still learning how to play that. And I think with Palestine and Gaza, we saw a form of a new maturity in Saudi foreign policy, where Saudi Arabia was willing to diverge, not through big rhetoric and angry statements, but quietly by working with France to produce a really important document of the United Nations, the New York Declaration, laying out a concrete path to Palestinian statehood on an issue where clearly it diverged fundamentally from the stated American position of both this administration and the one before it.